So one of the new things in the Baroque era was a new kind of truth. Before this period, scholars focused on reconciling what they observed in the world with the writings of sort of the ancient thinkers. So starting around 300, the 300s AD or so, you have these collections of writing on theology, philosophy, science, and all the rest by folks that are often referred to as the Church Fathers because they were members of the Christian Church. These folks incorporated ideas from even more ancient folks, the Greeks like Plato and such, into Christian thinking, and their writings, the writings of these church fathers and some others, formed the basis of a school of thinking called scholasticism, Scholasticism. This is a kind of for scholars in the 1400s, 1500s, Middle Ages, and Renaissance. This was a kind of truth from authority situation where the authorities, the church fathers, they said it, so it must be true. And this is okay for discovering certain things about the world, but not great for others. Here's an example of what an educated Englishman from 1599 believed. This is a quote. He believes witches can summon up storms that sink ships at sea. He believes in werewolves, although there happen not to be any in England. He knows that they are to be found in Belgium. He believes mice are spontaneously generated in piles of straw. He has seen a unicorn's horn, but not a unicorn. He believes that a murdered body will bleed in the presence of the murderer. He believes that there is an ointment, which, if rubbed on a dagger which has caused a wound, will cure the wound. And he believes that the earth stands still and that the sun and the stars revolve around it every 24 hours. This is not great as far as education goes. Now, after 1600, you have a new way of thinking about things that yields better results for understanding the world, empirical science. This is through, observation of the world, basing your deductions based on what you see and not relying on superstition or the thinking of the ancients for your answers. Through an experiment, you can see that mice don't come from piles of straw. They come from other mice. The most famous example, of course, is Galileo observing the stars and helping turn everything upside down with the new model of the solar system that put the sun at the center. The most compelling part of this, and the reason why it's such an important story, isn't the astronomy, but rather the defying of the ancient authorities who maintained that the earth was at the center of the universe. In music, we already saw this a little bit, with Monteverdi being willing to overthrow the established rules of harmony because he wanted a more powerfully expressive effect. But we're also going to see this kind of empirical thinking applied to composition, other kinds of composition. One example that the textbook mentions is the doctrine of the affections. So this is the idea that by exposing the audience to certain sounds, you could provoke in them involuntarily certain emotions, that you could literally manipulate their soul. So theorists wrote about this and came up with various musical rules for affecting people. Joy, they thought, caused the soul to expand. So if you wrote a piece with large intervals in it, it would provoke joy. And likewise, sadness contracted the soul. So small intervals would provoke sadness. Hope is elevation of the soul. So rising music gives you hope. Despair is the depression, the pushing down of the soul. So descending music, etc., and so on. This aligned with medical thinking at the time, which included this idea of the four humors. In this approach to medicine, there's basically four fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and they all related to physical health and emotional states. So, for example, I don't know if anyone knows the word sanguine. It was a vocab word from school for me, and it means optimistic, but it comes from this whole four humors thing. In the four humors, having blood, more blood than the other fluids, made you happy and optimistic. So that's why we call people who are happy and optimistic sanguine. The doctrine of the four humors saw the balance of the humors of these fluids as necessary to health. And so music that moved the affections could help this. So, you often see kind of contrasting emotions amongst different sections of a piece in an attempt to sort of move the affections in a balanced way. And this was serious business. This was like early music therapy. Another example of this kind of empirical sort of thinking coming into music was later in the Baroque era, when a composer named Jean-Philippe Rameau, Rameau, produced a theory text called the Treatise on Harmony. He observed what composers from the previous 100 years had done and came up with an almost entirely new system of thinking about music. So rather than thinking in terms of scales or modes and individual lines moving, Rameau basically introduced modern ideas about chords and harmony for the first time in a textbook that anyone could read. The stuff that you learned in theory about inversions, about dominant and tonic, and all sorts of other stuff, this all came from Rameau approaching music like a science, and being willing to overthrow sort of old ways of thinking about things. So because of the way that Galileo's way of thinking influenced music from this time period, Taruskin suggests calling this era the Age of Galileo. The last video is going to be about continuo.